The air in the grand ballroom of the Thorn Tower was a stratified element, thick with the scent of hothouse orchids and ambition. Below the suffocating weight of the gilded ceiling, 1,000 of Chicago's most powerful figures moved in carefully choreographed orbits of influence. Their laughter was a currency, their handshakes contracts. And at the center of this glittering galaxy stood Marcus Thorn, a man forged from old money and new ruthlessness, the host of the annual Elysian Ball. Damon Alexander stood near the periphery, a ghost at the feast. He wore a simple, dark gray turtleneck and charcoal trousers, an island of understated simplicity in a sea of bespoke tuxedos and couture gowns. He wasn't here to mingle. He was here to observe, to listen, to feel the pulse of the city's power structure from within its very heart. He nursed a glass of sparkling water, his presence a deliberate anomaly, a silent question in a room full of declarative statements. Then, Thorn saw him. A shark, sensing a drop of blood miles away. Thorn disengaged from a fawning conversation with a state senator and began to move through the crowd. The orbits of power warped around him, conversations faltering and then restarting as he passed. He was the sun, and everyone else was merely a planet held in his gravitational pull. He stopped directly in front of Damon, a predatory smile playing on his lips. The sudden, localized silence drew a constellation of curious eyes. Well. Thorn's voice was a theatrical baritone, pitched to carry over the string quartet's gentle melody. It seems we have a lost little sparrow who has flown a bit too far from his nest. Damon met his gaze, his expression unreadable, a placid lake over a fathomless depth. He said nothing. Thorn chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. He gestured vaguely at Damon's attire. This is a black tie event. My friend. Or did the invitation get smudged on its way to whatever back alley you crawled out of? A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the nearby guests. They were Thorn's audience, his chorus, and they knew their lines. Damon remained still, a statue of composure. This was the overture, the predictable display of dominance. But he knew Thorn better than that. The real attack was yet to come. Thorn leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was, paradoxically, meant for everyone to hear. He took in the details of Damon's face, the faint, silvery scar that traced a line just above his left eyebrow. His eyes glittered with a cold, ancient malice. You know, Thorn said, his smile widening. I have to admire the sheer audacity. Some people never learn their place. Do they? They rise from the ashes, but the soot always clings to them. The words struck Damon with the force of a physical blow. To the glittering crowd, it was a perfectly crafted classist barb, a casual dismissal of new money, a reminder of social hierarchy. But to Damon, it was a poisoned dart, dipped in the venom of a shared and buried past. Ashes. Soot. The words unlocked a chamber in his memory he kept perpetually sealed, a place that still smelled of smoke and sorrow. He was suddenly a boy of 14 again, standing on a winter street, watching orange flames devour his world, the soot of his life's incineration clinging to his skin, his hair, his soul. The ballroom, the orchestra, the 1,000 glittering faces, they all faded into a dull, distant roar. All he could see was Thorn's triumphant smirk. This wasn't a random insult. It was a message, a desecration. Thorn had taken the most sacred tragedy of Damon's life and weaponized it for sport in a room full of strangers. A profound, glacial calm settled over Damon. The storm of emotion he felt, the rage, the grief, the white-hot impulse to shatter Thorn's perfectly composed world right here and now was contained. compressed into a diamond-hard point of focus deep within him. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply held Thorn's gaze. And, in the unblinking stillness of his eyes, Marcus Thorn, for the first time that evening, saw something that was not admiration, not fear, but a cold and terrible promise. The crowd, sensing the shift, waited for the killing blow, the witty retort, or the angry outburst that would complete the spectacle. But Damon gave them nothing. He slowly, deliberately, raised his glass of water to his lips, took a small sip, and then placed it on the tray of a passing waiter. He gave Thorn one last, lingering look, a look that catalogued every detail of the man's face for future reference, and then turned and walked away. His exit was not a retreat. It was the calm before the typhoon. As he moved through the opulent ballroom and out into the cold Chicago night, the soot of Thorn's insult did not cling to him. It settled inside him, not as a stain of shame, but as fuel. The fire Thorn had so cruelly invoked was about to be reborn. The penthouse apartment was a testament to disciplined minimalism. It occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, glass and steel monolith in the heart of Chicago. Yet it felt less like a home than a command center. The furniture was sparse and functional, the colors muted grays and blacks. The only art on the walls were vast, high-resolution satellite images of urban landscapes: Chicago, Tokyo, London rendered in stark monochrome. The space was a reflection of its owner, powerful, precise, and devoid of sentimentality. Damon stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, the glittering sprawl of the city laid out before him like a schematic. It was 5:00 a.m. He had been awake for an hour, having already completed a punishing workout in his private gym, the physical exertion a necessary crucible for the fury that had simmered within him since the gala. The memory of Thorn's words echoed in the sterile silence, a discordant note in the symphony of his controlled existence. The soot always clings to them. The faint scent of jasmine tea announced the arrival of Anya Sharma, his chief of staff. She entered the room with a quiet efficiency that mirrored the space itself, placing a steaming mug on the granite countertop. She was a small woman with eyes that missed nothing, her mind a fortress of strategy and logistics. She was the architect who built the structures his vision demanded. "The preliminary report on Thorn Consolidated is on your tablet," she said, her voice calm and even. She didn't ask about the gala. She didn't need to. She had already seen the whispers on social media, the veiled blog posts from society columnists. She knew a line had been crossed. Their stock is stable, public sentiment is positive, and their board is loyal. He's well insulated. Damon turned from the window, his face etched in the pre-dawn light. Insulation is an illusion. Every fortress has a flaw in its foundation. He picked up the tablet, his fingers swiping through pages of financial data, corporate hierarchies, and personality profiles. His mind moved with terrifying speed, absorbing and processing, connecting disparate points of information into a coherent web. For the past decade, Alexander Industries had been his focus, a sprawling empire built on urban renewal, sustainable technology, and shrewd, data-driven investments. He had built it brick by brick from the ruins of his past, a monument to resilience. He had avoided conflict, preferring to build around obstacles rather than through them. But Thorn had not been an obstacle. He had been a declaration of war. "He targeted my history, Anya," Damon said, his voice low. "He thinks it's my weakness. We're going to make it his." Anya nodded, her expression unwavering. She was not his moral compass. She was his weapon. "What's the objective?" "Total dismantlement," Damon replied, the words cold and hard as the steel frame of the building. "We will deconstruct his empire, his reputation, and his legacy. We will leave him with nothing but the truth of what he is. But we will do it on our terms, with precision, and without collateral damage to the innocent. He set the tablet down and walked to a recessed panel in the wall. It slid open with a faint hiss, revealing not a safe, but a single, framed photograph. It was old and slightly faded, showing two young boys, no older than 10, sitting on the steps of a brick two-flat. One was Damon, smiling, a gap between his two front teeth. The other was a boy he once called a friend. The house in the background was the one that had burned to the ground. The soot, the ashes. The weight of that memory settled on him, not as a weakness, but as a sharpening stone. It was the engine of his discipline, the source of his relentless drive. It was the reason he lived in this sterile tower, high above the world, a self-imposed exile from the messiness of emotional connection. Later that morning, Damon drove himself a sleek, anonymous electric sedan out of the gleaming heart of the city and into the weathered, resilient streets of his past. He parked on a quiet block in the Pilsen neighborhood, the air thick with the smell of grilled corn and diesel fumes. He walked to a small, unassuming community center, its brick facade covered in vibrant murals. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and alive. The scent of coffee and old books filled the air. This was the headquarters of the Phoenix Foundation, the charitable arm of his empire, and the one place he allowed sentiment to breach his walls. Dr. Evelyn Reed looked up from the book she was reading to a group of children, her face lined with the wisdom of 70 years, breaking into a warm smile. She was a retired history professor who had been his mentor since he was a troubled teenager. The one person who had seen the fire in his eyes and taught him how to build with it instead of burn. She was his moral compass. "Damon," she said, her voice a comforting balm, "you're a long way from the glass towers." He sat with her in her small, cluttered office after the reading session was over. She poured him a cup of herbal tea, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not pry, but her perceptive gaze told him she knew something was wrong. "I saw Marcus Thorne last night," Damon said, the words feeling foreign in this place of healing and growth. Evelyn's smile faded slightly. "Marcus, I haven't heard that name in years. I always hoped he'd found some peace." "He hasn't," Damon said flatly. He recounted the conversation at the gala, omitting none of the cruelty, none of the calculated venom. He watched Evelyn's expression shift from concern to a deep, familiar sadness. "The wounds of the past run deep, for both of you," she said softly. "He is lashing out from a place of old pain. Damon, what he said was cruel, unforgivable, but how you choose to respond, that will define you, not him." He crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. "Evelyn." "I know," she said, her eyes holding his. "But you have built so much good here. This foundation, the scholarships, the opportunities you've created for children who were just like you. I only worry that a war with Marcus will force you to become something you fought so hard not to be. Revenge has a way of burning down the victor's house, as well as the vanquished's." Damon listened, absorbing her words, respecting the wisdom behind them. He knew she was right to be concerned, but she hadn't been there. She hadn't seen the look in Thorne's eyes, the casual desecration of a sacred memory. "This isn't just about me," he said, the conviction in his voice absolute. "Thorne represents a system, a corrupt, entrenched power that preys on the vulnerable and protects its own. To allow him to stand is to allow that system to persist. I'm not seeking revenge, Evelyn. I'm seeking an adjustment." He left the community center, feeling the familiar pull of two opposing forces, the cold, clean logic of his plan, and the warm, complicated wisdom of his mentor. As he drove back toward the gleaming, sterile skyline, he knew which path he had to take. He was not a boy standing in the ashes anymore. He was the architect of the fire that was to come. The first move had to be silent, precise, and utterly deniable. It was not a declaration of war, but a subtle tremor sent through the foundations of Marcus Thorne's empire. Damon and Anya sat in the sterile conference room of his penthouse, a holographic display projecting a three-dimensional map of Chicago's industrial district between them. "The South Branch Industrial Corridor," Anya said, her finger tracing a glowing red line along the river. "Thorne Consolidated has spent the last 18 months acquiring parcels, lobbying the zoning board, and greasing palms to get their Renaissance Point luxury development approved. It's his legacy project, the centerpiece of his portfolio." Damon studied the map, his mind absorbing the data points Anya narrated. He's over-leveraged. He bought the land with high-interest bridge loans, betting on a quick approval from the city council. The vote is in 3 weeks. His key ally on the council is Alderman Miller, Anya added, bringing up a photo of a florid, smiling politician. Thorne has been his largest campaign contributor for a decade. "Then Miller is our entry point," Damon said, "but not directly. We don't engage in bribery. We engage in truth." He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the holographic map. "Thorne thinks in terms of power and influence. We will think in terms of value and opportunity. We're going to present the city with a better option, an undeniable option." The plan unfolded with surgical precision over the next 2 weeks. Alexander Industries, through a newly created subsidiary named Greenleaf Urban Ventures, submitted a competing proposal for the South Branch Corridor. It was not a luxury development. It was a masterpiece of urban renewal, a mixed-use campus featuring a state-of-the-art tech incubator, affordable housing units for local workers, green spaces, and a publicly accessible riverwalk. It promised more jobs, higher long-term tax revenue, and significant community benefits. Critically, the Greenleaf proposal was fully funded, with no debt, and included a multi-million-dollar commitment to restore a nearby dilapidated public park, a park in Alderman Miller's ward. The proposal landed on the desks of the city council like a thunderclap. It was objectively, mathematically, and ethically superior to Thorne's plan. To vote for Thorne's project now would be an act of blatant political corruption. Damon decided this was the moment to make his decision known. He was in his office, the city lights a brilliant tapestry behind him. When he made the call, the memory of the gala, of Thorne's smug, cruel face, was a cold weight in his chest. He looked at the old photo on his desk, the image of two boys who had been friends, before the world had burned. This wasn't just business. It was a reckoning. "Anya," he said into his comm system, his voice steady. "He didn't just insult me. He desecrated a memory. We're going to dismantle him. Every brick." Anya's voice came back, calm and resolute. "I understand. The Greenleaf proposal is live. The press release goes out in 10 minutes. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Civic groups, news outlets, and community leaders lauded the Greenleaf proposal as a model for responsible urban development. Thorne was caught completely off guard. He had expected a bidding war, a game he knew how to win. He had not expected an ideological and economic masterstroke that painted his legacy project as a greedy land grab. The first obstacle appeared less than 48 hours later. Damon was reviewing architectural renderings for the Greenleaf project when Anya entered his office, her expression tight. "We have a problem." She projected a news article onto the main screen, The headline was stark, controversial developer behind Greenleaf proposal has ties to predatory lending. Environmental violations. The article, penned by a notoriously pugnacious journalist known to be in Thorne's pocket, was a carefully constructed piece of character assassination. It twisted details from one of Damon's earliest, most difficult projects, taking legitimate business struggles out of context to paint him as a ruthless gentrifier. It was filled with anonymous quotes from concerned community members who were, in reality, on Thorne's payroll. "He's not fighting the project," Damon observed, his voice dangerously calm. "He's fighting me." Simultaneously, Alderman Miller called a press conference. Standing on the steps of City Hall, he announced that, in light of troubling new information, he was calling for a full environmental impact review of the entire South Branch corridor, effectively freezing both projects for at least 6 months. He used his influence to change the rules of the game, Anya said, her fingers flying across her keyboard, pulling up city statutes and procedural documents. "The review board he's demanding is stacked with his appointees. He's burying us in bureaucracy." The final blow came in the form of a series of phone calls. One by one, the community leaders who had initially praised the Greenleaf project called to withdraw their public support. They were apologetic, but firm. They had received visits, quiet threats about funding for their nonprofits being cut, city permits for their events being mysteriously delayed. Thorne was calling in every favor, twisting every arm. Damon stood before the window, watching the city breathe below. His first move had been parried. Thorne had used his old-world network of favors and intimidation to stall Damon's clean, modern approach. He had turned Damon's allies into neutrals and painted him as the villain. "He thinks this is a victory," Damon said softly, a flicker of something cold and hard in his eyes. "He thinks he's pushed me back into the shadows." He turned to Anya. "He's made a tactical error. He's shown us his weapons smear campaigns and political machinery. He's forced us to escalate. Now, we stop playing on the public field. We go into the dark." Anya nodded, a new file already appearing on the screen between them. It was titled Project Chimera. "I've already engaged the team," she said. "Forensic accountants, digital forensic specialists, the best private investigators money can buy. They are discreet, and they are relentless." Damon looked at the file, then back out at the city. Thorne had built his castle on a foundation of secrets and lies. Damon was about to send in the archaeologists to dig it all up. The game was no longer about a single piece of land. It was about everything. The war moved into the shadows. Project Chimera was a ghost operation, an army of analysts and investigators moving silently through the digital and paper trails of Marcus Thorne's life. Anya orchestrated the effort from a secure, off-site location, a sterile data center, humming with the quiet power of servers processing terabytes of information. Damon received daily briefings, watching as the sprawling, labyrinthine structure of Thorne's empire was meticulously mapped. They started with the financials. A team of forensic accountants, led by a legendary but semi-retired auditor named Elias Vance, began to peel back the layers of Thorne Consolidated. On the surface, it was a blue-chip real estate firm, but beneath the polished annual reports, Vance's team found anomalies, a network of shell corporations registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, all seemingly designed to obscure the flow of money. "He's using transfer pricing schemes," Elias explained to Damon during a secure video call, his voice a dry rasp. "Thorne Consolidated pays exorbitant consulting fees to these shell companies for services never rendered. He's systematically bleeding his own public company dry to line his private pockets. It's brazen, but brilliantly hidden behind layers of legal jargon." While the accountants followed the money, A digital forensics team burrowed into Thorne's online presence. They found nothing illegal on his official servers. Thorne was too smart for that. But they did find a ghost, a pattern of encrypted communications between Thorne's personal devices and a server farm in Eastern Europe. They couldn't break the encryption. Not yet. But they had found the lock. Now they just needed the key. To truly understand his enemy, Damon knew he had to confront the past. This part of the investigation he had to conduct himself. He drove back to Pilsen, but this time he went deeper. To the blocks that hadn't yet been touched by the brush of gentrification. The air here was different, heavy with memory. He parked in front of a small, family-owned hardware store, its sign faded by decades of Chicago sun and snow. Inside, behind a counter cluttered with bolts and invoices, sat Leo Petricelli, a man whose face was a roadmap of a long and difficult life. Leo had known Damon's father. He had known Thorne's father, too. "Damon Alexander," Leo said, his eyes widening in surprise as he looked up from his newspaper. "My God, you look just like your dad." Damon bought a coffee from the deli next door and brought it back. For an hour, they talked. Damon didn't ask about Marcus directly. He asked about the old days. He asked about the neighborhood, about the businesses that had come and gone. He asked about Thorne Construction, the company run by Marcus's father, Alistair Thorne. Alistair was a proud man, Leo said, stirring his coffee with a screwdriver. A good builder, but a terrible businessman, always chasing the big score, always cutting corners to get there. He took on too much debt, made promises he couldn't keep. He was drowning long before that last project of his collapsed. Leo looked at Damon, his gaze heavy with unspoken history. People around here, they whispered things after the fire, about how your dad's insurance policy was the only thing that kept half this block from going bankrupt, after Alistair's company went under and took everyone with it. The conversation was a missing piece of the puzzle. Damon had always understood the fire as a personal tragedy. He had never fully grasped its economic impact on the community, or how his family's modest insurance payout had inadvertently become a lifeline for others. His next stop was the city archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled facility that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. With Anya's help, he had requested the public records for the bankruptcy of Thorne Construction. 40 years prior, he sat at a heavy oak table, a dusty box of files in front of him. He sifted through brittle legal documents, creditor lists, and court filings. And then he found it. A list of assets seized during the liquidation. Tucked among the lists of trucks and tools was a portfolio of small, seemingly insignificant properties Alistair Thorne had acquired over the years. Damon recognized the addresses. They were scattered across the city. But they all had one thing in common. They were places connected to Damon's own childhood. The lot where he and his friends played baseball. The corner where the old candy store used to be. The small apartment building where his grandparents had lived. Alistair Thorne hadn't just been buying land. He had been buying Damon's history. The final piece clicked into place when Anya's investigators sent him a digitized news photograph from the archives of the Chicago Tribune. It was dated the week after the fire. The photo showed the burnt-out shell of his family's two-flat, a grim skeleton against a gray sky, and standing across the street, half hidden behind a police barricade, were two figures. One was a distraught Alistair Thorne. The other was a boy of about 15, his face a mask of cold, unreadable fury. It was Marcus. Damon stared at the image, the grainy black and white figures seeming to move. The animosity wasn't new. It was ancient. It had been festering for decades. Marcus Thorne hadn't just watched Damon's home burn. He had been watching him ever since. He called Anya. His voice tight. Cross-reference the shell corporations Vance found with the property records from Alistair Thorne's bankruptcy portfolio. I want to see who owns those old lots now. He already knew what she would find. He could feel it. The line connecting the past to the present was no longer faint. It was a thick, unmissable cord of obsession. Thorne wasn't just a corporate rival. He was a ghost, haunting the landscape of Damon's life. And he had been for 40 years. The fight for the South Branch corridor was just the latest battle in a war Damon hadn't even known he was fighting. The call came at 3:00 a.m., jarring Damon from a restless sleep. It was Anya, her voice stripped of its usual calm, replaced by an urgent, clipped tone. He knows. I don't know how. But he knows we're digging. The discovery that followed was a masterclass in corporate espionage. The digital forensics team had finally found a key, not to Thorne's encrypted server, but to something far more insidious. Thorne had a mole inside the city's permitting office. For years, he had been receiving advance notice of every major development proposal, every zoning variance request, every competitor's move. The information fed into a sophisticated algorithm that predicted real estate trends with unnerving accuracy. It was the secret engine of his success, a machine built on corruption and stolen data. It was also how he'd been alerted to Greenleaf Urban Ventures' proposal before it was even made public. The algorithm flagged our land acquisition patterns as a high-level threat, Anya explained, her voice tight with grudging admiration. He didn't know it was you specifically. Not at first. But when we filed the Greenleaf proposal, it confirmed his suspicions. He's been watching our digital footprint ever since. Damon sat up, the city lights painting stark patterns on the walls of his bedroom. The game had changed again. Thorne was no longer just defending. He was actively hunting them. He had reframed the entire conflict, turning it from a battle for power into a deeply personal reckoning with the past. The revelation landed with the force of an earthquake, shattering the foundations of Damon's understanding of the conflict. He sat in his sterile office, the single faded photograph of him and Marcus as children seeming to mock him from its frame. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Anya laid it all out on the holographic display, a web of connections spanning 40 years. Alistair Thorne's construction company went bankrupt 1 week after the fire. Not because of the fire, but the timing was the final nail in the coffin. He had leveraged everything on one massive municipal contract that collapsed due to his own mismanagement. When his company folded, it created a vacuum. Your father, using the insurance money from your home, partnered with Leo Petrocelli and a few others to start a small cooperative contracting firm to finish some of the abandoned jobs. It was meant to be a lifeline for the neighborhood. She paused, letting the weight of the information settle. That small firm was the seed that eventually grew into the first iteration of Alexander Industries. Marcus Thorne doesn't see you as a competitor, Damon. He sees you as a usurper. In his mind, you built your empire on the ashes of his family's legacy. The insult from the gala echoed in his mind. No longer a simple barb, but the thesis statement of a lifelong vendetta. They rise from the ashes, but the soot always clings to them. Thorne believed Damon was stained by the destruction of the Thorne family. He saw Damon's success not as a story of resilience, but as a story of theft. The knowledge was chilling. It recontextualized every move Thorne had made, every obstacle he had erected. This wasn't business. It was a crusade. Marcus Thorne was trying to reclaim a stolen birthright, to avenge the ghost of his father. Damon felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, a sliver of understanding, almost pity. He saw the world through Marcus's eyes for a moment, a boy watching his father's dreams crumble, seeing another family rise from the tragedy, and twisting that narrative into a story of betrayal. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by the cold reality of Thorne's actions. Understanding his motive didn't excuse his methods. The corruption, the smear campaigns, the threats they were, the choices of a man poisoned by his own history. "He is trapped by the past," Damon said, his voice quiet. "He's been fighting a ghost. It's time to show him a real monster." The discovery galvanized their strategy. They now understood the emotional core of their enemy. They knew his pressure points, his obsessions. The fight was no longer just about dismantling a corrupt empire. It was about deconstructing a false narrative that had festered for 4 decades. They had the motive. They had the means. Now, they just had to wait for the moment to strike. Thorne, sensing Damon's invisible net tightening around him, did not wait. He decided to turn the Cold War hot. He launched an attack so devastating, so public, and so personal that it was designed not just to wound Damon, but to cripple him. The attack came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a whisper in a society column. It was a front-page exposé in the Chicago Chronicle, the city's most respected newspaper. The headline was explosive: "The Phoenix and the Vulture How. Billionaire Damon Alexander built his empire on the ruin of a working-class family." The article was a masterpiece of malicious storytelling. It used the same facts Anya had uncovered but twisted them into a damning narrative. It painted Alistair Thorne as a salt-of-the-earth builder, a victim of circumstance. It framed Damon's father as an opportunistic predator who used insurance money, blood money from a tragic fire. The article called it to cannibalize a competitor's dying business. It portrayed a young Damon, not as a survivor, but as the callous heir to a stolen legacy. But Thorne didn't stop there. The second half of the article was aimed directly at the heart of Damon's world, the Phoenix Foundation, using leaked, heavily doctored financial documents. The article accused the foundation of being a tax shelter and a slush fund. It alleged that only a fraction of its funds went to the community, while the rest was funneled into Damon's speculative real estate ventures. It featured interviews with concerned citizens, the same paid actors from his earlier smear campaign lamenting how they had been betrayed. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. By noon, news trucks were camped outside the community center. The foundation's phone lines were flooded with angry calls. Corporate sponsors, spooked by the allegations, began to publicly announce they were suspending their donations pending an investigation. The very people Damon had dedicated his life to helping were now looking at him with suspicion and anger. He drove to the foundation, pushing his way through a throng of reporters. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal. Dr. Evelyn Reed met him in the hallway, her face etched with a deep and profound sorrow. "They're freezing our accounts." "Damon," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The city grant we rely on for the after-school program has been put on hold. The parents are scared. They think we've been using their children as props." Damon saw the raw pain in her eyes, and it cut deeper than any of Thorne's public accusations. Thorne hadn't just attacked his reputation. He had attacked his soul. He was threatening to burn down the one thing Damon had built that was pure, the one sanctuary he had created from the ashes of his past. He was in a corner. A public rebuttal would only lend credibility to the lies, trapping him in a he said, she said news cycle. A lawsuit would take years, and the foundation would be dead long before a verdict was reached. He returned to his penthouse, the city lights outside his window seeming to mock his impotence. Anya was there, her usual composure replaced by a cold fury. "This is scorched earth," she said, displaying the cascading negative sentiment analysis on the main screen. "He's not trying to win. He's trying to ensure that if he goes down, he takes your entire world with him." Damon stood before the window, his back to the room. The rage inside him was a white-hot nova. Thorne had made the ultimate mistake. He had targeted innocent people. He had weaponized the very community Damon was trying to heal. "He has accelerated the timeline," Damon said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. He turned, his face a mask of cold resolve. "He thinks he has me trapped, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous." He looked at Anya. "Thorn Consolidated's annual shareholders meeting is in 1 week. Get me a seat at the table." Anya's eyes widened slightly. "Damon, we only have a minor stake through Greenleaf. You won't have a vote." "I don't need a vote," Damon replied. "I just need a microphone." The plan was no longer about a slow, systematic dismantling. Thorn had forced his hand. This would be a public execution, a high-stakes corporate showdown with no room for error. All the pieces they had gathered, the shell corporations, the digital forensics, the story of the past, would now be deployed at once. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, but Damon knew it was the only move he had left. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of corporate power. Hundreds of shareholders, analysts, and journalists filled the tiered seating, their faces illuminated by the glow of laptops and smartphones. On the stage, under the glare of television lights, sat the board of directors of Thorn Consolidated. At its center, Marcus Thorn presided over the annual meeting with the smug confidence of a king addressing his court. The live broadcast was being carried on every major financial news network. Damon Alexander entered from a side door, unnoticed. He wore a perfectly tailored dark navy suit, a quiet statement of power that needed no embellishment. Anya was with him, a slim tablet clutched in her hand. They took their seats in the third row, anonymous figures in a sea of expectant faces. Damon's presence had been secured through a procedural loophole Anya had discovered, granting a representative of a significant minority stakeholder the right to address the board during the open Q&A session. Thorn delivered his opening remarks, a glowing report of record profits and ambitious future projects. He was magnanimous, charming, in complete control of his narrative. He made a veiled reference to aggressive new competitors and unfounded attacks in the media, dismissing them as the jealous actions of lesser men. His eyes scanned the crowd, but he did not see Damon. Not yet. The meeting proceeded through its choreographed agenda. Then came the Q&A. The moderator opened the floor. "The chair recognizes the representative from Greenleaf Urban Ventures," the moderator announced, reading from a pre-submitted list. A murmur went through the crowd. A single spotlight swiveled and found Damon as he stood and walked to the microphone in the aisle. On the stage, Marcus Thorn's confident smile froze, then curdled into a mask of disbelief and fury. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the silent, electric confrontation between the two men. "Mr. Thorn," Damon began, his voice calm, clear, and amplified throughout the cavernous room. "My name is Damon Alexander." The name landed like a bomb. Whispers erupted. Phones were raised. The journalists in the press pit began typing furiously. "I am not here to discuss the South Branch development," Damon continued, his eyes locked on Thorn. "I am here to discuss the fundamental health and integrity of this company." Anya, from her seat, tapped a command on her tablet. On the massive screen behind the board of directors, Thorn's carefully prepared presentation was instantly replaced by a complex flowchart. At its center was the Thorn Consolidated logo. Branching out from it were the names of a dozen shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. For the past decade, Damon's voice was a surgeon's scalpel, precise and cold. Thorn Consolidated has paid over $200 million in consulting fees to these entities which, our research shows, have no employees, no offices, and provide no actual services. They exist for a single purpose: to siphon money from this public company directly into the private accounts of its CEO. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thorne gripped the arms of his chair, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is an outrageous and baseless accusation," he boomed into his microphone. "Is it?" Damon replied calmly. Anya tapped her tablet again. The flowchart was replaced by a series of bank transfer records, shareholder funds flowing from Chicago to the Caymans, then to a private Swiss bank account. The account number was visible. The name on the account was Marcus Thorne. The room fell into a stunned silence. Damon had just committed corporate murder on live television. "These are fabrications," Thorne stammered, his voice losing its authority. "They are verifiable public records, obtained legally," Damon stated. "But this financial deception is only part of the story." He looked directly at the shareholders. "Mr. Thorne hasn't just been betraying your trust. He has been using your money to fund a 40-year-old personal vendetta." The screen changed again, displaying the news photo of a young Marcus Thorne standing before the ashes of Damon's home. Damon calmly, factually, recounted the true history of their families, of Alistair Thorne's failed business, of his father's small cooperative, of Marcus's twisted narrative of revenge. He presented it not as a personal grievance, but as a case study in the CEO's unstable and obsessive character, a clear and present danger to the company's governance. Thorne was a cornered animal, his empire crumbling around him in real time. The board members were visibly distancing themselves from him. His reign was over. Damon had won. He had the final, irrefutable evidence, the key to the encrypted server, provided by a whistleblower emboldened by the morning's events that would not only prove the fraud, but would lead to criminal charges carrying decades in prison. This was the final blow. As he prepared to deliver it, Anya moved silently to his side and handed him a single folder. Her face was grim. "You need to see this. It just came through." Damon opened it. Inside was a file he had never seen before. It contained documents, financial transfers, and a letter. Despite his corruption, Marcus Thorne had been making large, anonymous donations for the past 15 years. The recipient was the Chicago General Hospital. The designation was for the construction and ongoing funding of the Alistair Thorne Advanced Burn Unit, the city's premier facility for treating fire victims. The same unit that had, years ago, treated survivors of the very fire that had defined Damon's life. The funding for this genuinely good, life-saving project was inextricably tied to the same corrupt shell corporations Damon had just exposed. To release the final piece of evidence, the evidence that would send Thorne to prison, would trigger a full asset seizure by the federal government. The burn unit's endowment would be frozen, its future destroyed. A chill ran down Damon's spine. The secondary twist. He was standing at the pinnacle of his victory, the sword of justice in his hand, and he was suddenly faced with an impossible moral choice: utter annihilation for his enemy, or the preservation of a legacy of healing built on a foundation of lies. The entire room, the entire financial world, watched him, waiting for the killing stroke. He looked from the file in his hands to Marcus Thorne on the stage, a broken, defeated man, stripped bare before the world. He saw not a monster, but a man poisoned by a memory, a man who, in his own twisted way, had been trying to build something from the ashes. Too. Damon took a deep breath. He closed the folder. "The evidence of financial mismanagement is clear," he said, his voice resonating with a new, somber authority. "It is my recommendation to the board and the shareholders that Mr. Thorne be removed as CEO, effective immediately. Furthermore, I propose that a full, independent audit be conducted, and that Mr. Thorne personally repay every dollar that was improperly funneled from this company. His personal assets, I believe, are more than sufficient to make the shareholders whole." He paused, letting the weight of his decision settle. As for criminal charges, I will leave that to the discretion of the new board. I believe this company's future is better served by focusing on rebuilding, not retribution. He had made his choice, in front of everyone. He had chosen creation over destruction, mercy over absolute revenge. He had left Thorne stripped of his power, his reputation, and his fortune. But he had spared the one good thing his enemy had built. He had spared the burn unit. He had broken the cycle. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The Thorne Consolidated Board, desperate to salvage the company's reputation, voted unanimously to accept Damon's terms. Marcus Thorne was gone before the end of the day. His nameplate pried from his office door. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered on Wall Street. News cameras captured him leaving the Drake Hotel through a service exit. A man, suddenly aged by decades, his tailored suit hanging on him like a shroud. There was a brief, final moment when his eyes met Damon's across the chaotic lobby. There were no words, only the silent, exhausted acknowledgement that their long, secret war was finally over. The following days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and corporate restructuring. Damon, through Alexander Industries, oversaw the transition, ensuring the company was stabilized and the defrauded funds were meticulously returned. The burn unit's endowment was quietly and legally separated from the toxic assets and secured in a new, protected trust, its future guaranteed. A week after the shareholder meeting, Damon found himself back at the Phoenix Foundation. The news trucks were gone. The angry calls had ceased. In their place, a tentative hope was beginning to bloom. The corporate sponsors, seeing Thorne's public downfall and the truth of the matter, had not only reinstated their funding, but had doubled it. He found Dr. Evelyn Reed in her office, packing boxes of books for a community literacy drive. The warm afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "I saw what you did," she said, not looking up from her task. "It was all over the news. You had him. You could have destroyed him completely." "It wouldn't have been justice," Damon replied, his voice quiet. "It would have just been more burning." Evelyn stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her eyes shining with a fierce, maternal pride. "The boy I met all those years ago, the one who was so full of rage he could barely speak, he would have burned it all down. The man you've become. Damon, you chose to build something instead. You saved that burn unit. You saved a piece of him. And in doing so, you saved a piece of yourself." He felt the heavy weight of the victory, a feeling that was not triumphant, but profoundly peaceful. It was the feeling of a war ended, of a great and terrible burden finally laid to rest. He spent the rest of the afternoon at the foundation, not as a billionaire benefactor, but as a volunteer. He helped unload boxes, read stories to the children, and listened to the hopes and struggles of the people from his old neighborhood. He was reconnecting with his purpose, the reason he had started building his empire in the first place, not to conquer the world, but to heal a small, broken piece of it. The cycle of revenge was broken, but the past was not erased. It was simply integrated. He had faced the ghost that had haunted both him and Marcus Thorne, and he had chosen not to fight it, but to understand it, and, in doing so, to finally move beyond it. 6 months later, Damon stood on a desolate, wind-swept lot in Pilsen. The ground was a patchwork of cracked concrete and stubborn weeds, enclosed by a chain-link fence. To most people, it was a forgotten piece of urban decay. To Damon, it was hallowed ground. This was the exact spot where his childhood home had once stood, the epicenter of the tragedy that had forged his life and Marcus Thorne's vendetta. Anya Sharma stood beside him, holding a set of architectural blueprints. The wind whipped at her hair, but her expression was serene. The city council approved the acquisition and zoning variances yesterday, she said, unanimously. Damon looked out over the empty space, but he wasn't seeing what was there. He was seeing what would be. He wasn't building another glass and steel tower. He was building a symbol. The Phoenix Center, he said, the name feeling right on his tongue. A community hub, a business incubator for young entrepreneurs from the neighborhood, a place with classrooms, workshops, and mentorship programs. We're not just reclaiming this land, Anya. We're reconsecrating it. We're turning a place of ashes into a place of opportunity. It was the final act, the ultimate refutation of Thorne's bitter philosophy. True power was not in tearing down, but in building up. It was the symbolic resolution to a conflict that had spanned his entire life. A definitive statement that he would use his influence not to perpetuate cycles of destruction, but to create cycles of growth. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning. The lot was filled with community members, city officials, and the smiling, hopeful faces of the children from the Phoenix Foundation. Dr. Evelyn Reed stood at the podium, her voice filled with emotion as she spoke of resilience and rebirth. Damon stood quietly to the side, content to be a spectator at the culmination of his journey. As the ceremony concluded, a courier delivered a small, flat package to Anya, who, in turn, passed it to Damon. There was no return address. Curious. He opened it. Inside was no letter, no legal document. There was only a check, made out to the Phoenix Center, from an anonymous trust. The sum was staggering, enough to fund the center's operational budget for its first 5 years. Tucked behind the check was a small, faded photograph, its edges soft with age. It showed 2 young boys, no older than 10, grinning at the camera on a summer day. One was Damon, the other was Marcus Thorne. They were sitting on the front steps of the house that had once stood right here, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in the easy, uncomplicated camaraderie of childhood, long before the world had caught fire and taught them how to hate. Damon stared at the photograph, a wave of complex emotion washing over him. It was not forgiveness. It was not forgetting. It was an acknowledgement, a final, silent message from a vanquished enemy, a shared memory from a time before the ashes. It was a small, unexpected gesture of understanding, a final surprise that solidified the profound truth he had come to learn, that the past could never be erased. But a better future could always be built upon its ruins.